A master's gavel fell at 12 cents, sealing a pregnant woman's fate at an auction block that traded in human lives. She carried not just a child, but the living evidence of her previous owner's cruel exploitation. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The gray clouds hung low over Greenshire on that fateful March morning in 1853. A bitter wind swept across the courthouse square, carrying the mingled scents of sweat and molasses that clung to everything in this corner of Louisiana. The auction block, a simple wooden platform worn smooth by countless bodies, stood as a monument to human cruelty in the center of the square. Clara stood with quiet dignity, her slender frame accentuated by the gentle swell of her belly. At 23, her eyes held wisdom beyond her years, a testament to hardships endured since childhood. She kept her chin raised despite the murmurs rippling through the crowd, their gazes lingering on her pregnant form, visible evidence of her previous master's transgressions. Duncan Fairholme occupied the edge of the platform, his tailored coat and polished boots marking him as plantation aristocracy. The young heir's cold eyes calculated each movement, each reaction from the assembled townsfolk. His thin lips occasionally twitched with something resembling satisfaction as the auctioneer began his practiced spiel. Next up, healthy young woman, experienced in household duties, the auctioneer announced, his voice like sandpaper scraping across the morning silence. His weathered hand gestured toward Clara, without quite touching her. Bidding starts at $5. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in Greenshire understood what was happening. This wasn't commerce, but theater, a performance of power orchestrated by Duncan. $4? The auctioneer tried, desperation creeping into his voice as the silence stretched. $3? The price continued to drop as potential buyers averted their eyes. Clara's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her only visible reaction to the deliberate humiliation. $1? The auctioneer's voice cracked. From the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward. Isaiah Mercer, middle-aged and weathered, raised his hand. 12 cents, he called out, his voice steady despite the gasps that followed. A reverent hush fell over the gathering. 12 cents wasn't a bargain, it was a message. A public declaration that Clara's worth had been deliberately diminished. Duncan's eyes narrowed at Mercer, but satisfaction played across his features. The punishment was unfolding exactly as planned. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack that echoed across the square. Sold to Isaiah Mercer for 12 cents. As Clara was led from the platform, she caught sight of William Fairholme at the edge of the crowd, Duncan's younger brother's face etched with helpless anguish. She turned away, refusing to meet his gaze. His compassion had brought them both to this moment. Her to public humiliation, him to fraternal retribution. The bill of sale changed hands, a flimsy piece of paper that determined a human life. 12 cents, the price of vengeance, the cost of a brother's betrayal. And for Clara, perhaps the first step on an unexpected path to something resembling freedom. The whispers rippled through the crowd as Isaiah Mercer's bid hung in the humid air. 12 cents, the price of a loaf of bread in Greenshire, the price Duncan Fairholme had placed on Clara's dignity. The townspeople exchanged knowing glances. Everyone in the parish understood the cruel calculation behind the auction. William Fairholme, the younger of the plantation heirs, had once attempted to purchase Clara's freedom papers. His compassion had become his undoing in the eyes of his brother. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel struck with finality, the sound echoing across the courthouse square. To Mr. Mercer for 12 cents. Clara stood motionless on the wooden platform, her hands instinctively cradling her swollen belly. The child within her, evidence of her previous master's violations, kicked as if sensing the tension surrounding them. She fixed her gaze on a distant cypress tree, refusing to acknowledge the sea of faces below. William Fairholme remained rooted at the edge of the gathering, his complexion ashen against his dark coat. Guilt radiated from him in palpable waves. He had tried to help her, yes, but his failure now hung between them like an unbreachable chasm. His fingers twitched at his sides, a man desperate to act but paralyzed by his position. "The paperwork, Mr. Mercer," the courthouse clerk announced, producing the bill of sale with mechanical efficiency. Isaiah Mercer stepped forward, weathered hands counting out the humiliating sum. Each copper coin made a hollow sound as it fell onto the clerk's table. The middle-aged man's expression revealed nothing as the official stamp marked the document, transferring Clara's ownership for less than the price of a drink at the local establishment. Duncan observed the proceedings from beneath the shade of the courthouse portico, satisfaction evident in his cold smile. The elder Fairholme had orchestrated this public spectacle not merely to punish Clara, but to break his brother's spirit. His message was clear. Compassion was weakness, and weakness would be exposed. Clara finally allowed her eyes to drift across the crowd, deliberately avoiding William's desperate gaze. She had learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The young woman felt something shift within her, not just her child, but her resolve hardening into something new and dangerous. As Mercer approached to claim his property, Clara noticed something unexpected in his eyes. Not cruelty or lust, but something more complex. The weathered man extended his hand not to grab her, but to help her down from the platform. The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet as she took that first step. 12 cents had purchased her body, but as she descended into this new uncertainty, she silently vowed that her spirit would remain her own, a price beyond calculation. Isaiah Mercer guided Clara away from the courthouse steps, his weathered fingers clutching the bill of sale, a piece of paper that had just transferred her life for 12 cents. The March wind carried whispers from the dispersing crowd, but neither spoke as they moved through Greenshire's muddy streets. "My wagon's just beyond those trees," Isaiah finally said, his voice low and gravelly. There was something in his tone, a hesitance, perhaps even shame, that made Clara study him more carefully. The man was middle-aged, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a slight stoop to his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long. The wagon itself was nothing remarkable. Old wooden wheels that creaked with each rotation, a faded canvas cover, and a single horse whose ribs showed slightly beneath its coat. But it was what lay inside that caught Clara's attention. Several rough blankets, arranged with unexpected care, a small bundle of provisions, and a single, battered Bible resting atop a wooden crate. "You'll want to rest," the man said, offering his hand to help her climb aboard. Clara ignored it, managing on her own despite her swollen belly. Her child, the evidence of her previous master's cruelty, kicked as she settled onto the makeshift bed. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, one hand protectively covering her stomach. Isaiah climbed onto the driver's seat, flicking the reins gently. "North," he replied simply, "away from the sugarcane fields." As they rolled out of Greenshire, Clara watched the plantation houses grow smaller in the distance. The courthouse where Duncan Fairholme had orchestrated her humiliation disappeared behind a bend in the road. She thought of William's face in the crowd, pale with helplessness and guilt, and hardened her heart against the memory. "I'm not what you think," Isaiah said, after they traveled in silence for nearly an hour. "And what do I think?" Clara challenged, finding her voice. The man's shoulders tensed. "That I'm just another master." Clara studied the back of his head, the way his hands held the reins, not too tight, not too loose. Her mother had taught her to read people better than books. This man carried regret like a second skin. "Then what are you?" she pressed. Isaiah turned slightly, his profile silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "Someone trying to make something right." The wagon continued northward as Clara's mind raced with possibilities. Was this truly an escape, or merely a different kind of trap? The child within her stirred again, as if sharing her uncertainty. Freedom seemed as distant as the horizon, and just as unreachable. Yet something about the battered Bible and Isaiah Mercer's hushed words kindled a dangerous feeling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The wagon creaked and swayed through the dense Louisiana wilderness, following paths that seemed to vanish and reappear with the shifting shadows. Isaiah Mercer kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure they weren't being followed. Clara sat with her back straight, despite her exhaustion, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. 3 days into their journey, the silence between them had become a third passenger. When they stopped each evening, Mercer would wordlessly prepare a modest meal, stale bread and dried apples pulled from a canvas sack. He'd place her portion on a cloth near the fire, then retreat to his side of the camp. "You should eat," he said on the 4th night, his voice rough from disuse. For the child, Clara took the food without meeting his eyes. "Where are you really taking me?" she asked, breaking her own silence. The former slave trader sighed, running a weathered hand through his graying hair. "Somewhere safe, that's all I can promise." The cypress swamps gave way to pine forests as they traveled northward. Clara watched the transformation of the landscape, memorizing landmarks and listening to the changing chorus of creatures. In the evenings, bullfrogs bellowed their ancient songs while whip-poor-wills called in the distance. These sounds transported her back to childhood, to nights when her mother would whisper stories beneath the stars. "My mama used to say freedom was like a river," Clara said softly one evening, surprising herself by speaking. "Always moving, never stopping for anyone. Said we had to be ready to jump in when it passed by." Mercer nodded, his face half illuminated by firelight. "Your mother sounds wise. She taught me to be quiet when strangers were around. Said silence was sometimes the only shield we had." Clara looked directly at him. "Is that why you barely speak? Are you shielding yourself from something?" The man stared into the flames. "Maybe I'm just trying to give you peace." Each mile they traveled was both a deliverance and a danger. Clara measured the journey in prayers, one for each bend in the road, each creek they forded. Each time Mercer tensed at the sound of approaching horses. Her hope was fragile, a flickering candle that could be extinguished by a single harsh breath. On the 6th night, as they camped near a small stream, Clara noticed Mercer reading from his battered Bible by firelight. His lips moved silently over the words, fingers tracing each line as if searching for absolution. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" he asked, without looking up. Clara considered the question, her hand still resting on her unborn child. "I believe in survival," she answered. "Everything else comes after." The outskirts of Pine Crossing emerged through the morning mist as Isaiah Mercer guided the wagon along the rutted path. Clara's hands rested protectively over her swollen belly, her eyes scanning the tree line with the vigilance of prey sensing danger. She spotted them first, 3 riders on the distant ridge, silhouettes against the pale sky. "We're being watched," she whispered, not turning to face Mercer. The middle-aged man flicked the reins casually, as if he hadn't heard her. "Just travelers, like us." "Those are Duncan Fairholm's men," Clara insisted, recognizing the distinctive posture of the lead rider, the plantation overseer who had once delivered her punishment for attempting escape. "They're following us." Mercer's weathered face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles whitened around the reins. "We'll be fine, trust me." Trust. The word hung between them like smoke. Clara had survived this long by trusting no one, least of all men who appeared from nowhere with convenient rescue plans. She studied his profile, searching for deception. That evening, they made camp in a small clearing, far enough from the main road to avoid casual discovery. The fire cast dancing shadows as Mercer handed Clara a tin cup of broth. The riders hadn't appeared again, but she felt their presence like a weight on her shoulders. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked. "What do you gain?" Mercer stared into the flames for so long Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, His voice was rough with emotion. "I was once in the trade," he confessed, unable to meet her eyes. "Bought and sold people like cattle, separated mothers from children, husbands from wives." Clara's body tensed, instinctively shifting away from him. "I watched families destroyed," he continued, his voice cracking, "including yours." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. "You were there? In Richmond?" Mercer nodded, shame etched in every line of his face. "I've spent 15 years trying to undo what I helped create. I can't bring back your family, but I can get you to safety." Clara studied him, this broken man seeking redemption through her survival. His guilt might drive him to protect her, but it could just as easily collapse under pressure. "Duncan's men will catch up eventually," she said quietly. "I know." Mercer's eyes finally met hers. "But I swear on everything I hold sacred, they won't take you back." Clara nodded, not in trust, but in acknowledgement. She would use his guilt as protection for as long as it served her, but she would also be ready to run when, not if, his protection failed. Her child's future depended on her vigilance, not his redemption. William Fairholme sat alone in his study, a half-empty glass of bourbon trembling in his hand. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, reminding him of Clara's eyes when she stood on that auction block, defiant yet wounded, refusing to break, even as her dignity was sold for 12 cents. He took another swig, wincing as the liquor burned down his throat. The plantation house felt cavernous tonight, each creak and settling sound an accusation. William knew what everyone in Greenshire whispered behind cupped hands, how he had tried to purchase Clara's freedom, how his brother had discovered the plan, and how Duncan had orchestrated the public humiliation as punishment for them both. "Damn you, Duncan," he muttered, reaching for paper and ink. His third letter to Judge Amos Crenshaw this week. Perhaps this one would not go unanswered. The quill scratched desperately across the parchment. Pleas for intervention, offers of payment, even veiled threats of exposing the judge's own indiscretions. The young Fairholme sealed the envelope with shaking hands. He had loved Clara silently for months, watching her quiet strength as she worked in the kitchens. When he learned of her pregnancy, his brother's doing, something in him had finally broken. His attempt to free her had been clumsy, naive. Now she was gone, sold to Isaiah Mercer, a man with a shadowy past and uncertain intentions. Outside his window, the sugarcane fields stretched toward the horizon, a fortune built on broken bodies. The plantation workers moved like ghosts in the twilight, avoiding his gaze. They knew, everyone knew. Master William, his house servant, appeared at the doorway, face carefully blank. "Your brother has returned from town." William nodded, dismissing the man with a wave. The rumors had spread like wildfire through Greenshire Parish. How the younger Fairholme had tried to undermine the natural order. How his compassion was weakness. How Duncan had restored family honor through public punishment. He drained his glass. The letter to Judge Crenshaw would likely join its predecessors, unanswered, perhaps unread. The old judge valued order above all else, and William's actions threatened that precious stability. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, Duncan's confident stride. William straightened his posture, preparing for another confrontation. His brother had weaponized Clara's fate against him, knowing exactly where to strike to cause maximum pain. The irony was bitter. In trying to save Clara, William had only ensured her suffering. His compassion had become his curse, and somewhere out there, a pregnant woman carried the consequence of his failed rescue. He could only pray that Mercer, despite his reputation, might show more mercy than his own blood had. Judge Amos Crenshaw sat alone in his study, the flame of a single candle casting long shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk. Outside, the Louisiana night hummed with insects and distant thunder, but inside, only the scratching of his quill pen broke the silence. Before him lay the bill of sale from that morning's auction, a document so thin, yet so heavy with consequence. The judge's weathered fingers traced the signature at the bottom, where Isaiah Mercer had claimed ownership of Clara for 12 cents. 12 cents, less than the cost of the ink used to record the transaction. Crenshaw knew the story behind this mockery of a sale, how William Fairholme had shown compassion where his brother Duncan saw only property. Order above all, he whispered to himself, a mantra repeated through 30 years on the bench. The elderly jurist could have declared the sale void on numerous grounds. The price was clearly not market value. The pregnant woman's condition warranted special consideration. The motivation behind Duncan's actions was transparently vindictive, yet he would not. Crenshaw dipped his quill and signed his approval with a flourish that belied his inner conflict. To him, the law was not about justice, but about predictability. Chaos was the true enemy of civilization, and exceptions, even merciful ones, invited chaos. The judge poured himself a small glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the candlelight, as he contemplated his role in this drama. He had seen William's face in the crowd that morning, pale with anguish. He had witnessed Duncan's cold satisfaction, and he had observed Clara's dignity, her chin lifted despite the humiliation being inflicted upon her. One woman's suffering against the stability of our entire way of life, he reasoned aloud, as if arguing before an invisible court. The system must be preserved. Crenshaw placed the document in the courthouse ledger, recording Clara as just another transaction in Greenshire's history. The pregnant woman would join countless others whose fates were sealed by his signature. Souls reduced to entries in leather-bound books. As he closed the ledger, a letter caught his eye. William's plea for intervention, delivered that afternoon. The judge picked it up, considered it briefly, then held it to the candle. The paper blackened and curled, turning to ash in his fireplace. "May God forgive what men cannot change," he murmured, though he wasn't certain if he meant Clara's bondage or his own complicity. The candle guttered as a breeze found its way through the shutters. In the momentary darkness, Judge Crenshaw thought he heard something, perhaps the whisper of conscience, or perhaps just the wind through the cypress trees, carrying away prayers that would never be answered. The wagon creaked to a halt outside a weathered clapboard house on the outskirts of Willow Bend. Isaiah Mercer helped Clara down, his calloused hands gentle but distant. The journey had taken its toll on both of them. Clara's pregnancy more visible with each passing day, Mercer's eyes more haunted. "This is it," he whispered. "Ruth Chambers runs this safe house. She's good people." The door opened before they knocked. Ruth Chambers stood in the threshold, her body so thin it seemed the evening breeze might carry her away. Despite her frailty, her eyes burned with fierce determination, though Clara noticed the unnatural brightness that spoke of fever. "Get inside, quickly," Ruth urged, scanning the road behind them. "Duncan's men passed through yesterday." Clara's heart stuttered. She instinctively placed a protective hand over her swollen belly as she stepped into the dimly lit home. The interior smelled of herbs and wood smoke, with 3 small children peering from behind a faded curtain. "They're looking for you," Ruth said, pouring thin broth into wooden bowls. "A runaway worth less than a silver coin," they said. "Described you perfectly." Her gaze lingered on Clara's stomach. "That child you carry, it's more than just a baby, isn't it? It's your future, your legacy." Mercer sat heavily in a corner chair. "We'll move on at first light. The network can get us closer to New Orleans." Ruth shook her head, a coughing fit racking her thin frame. "Not so simple. They set up checkpoints on all the main roads south. They're determined." Clara sipped the broth, warmth spreading through her tired body. Why would Duncan Fairholme spend so much effort tracking someone he valued at 12 cents? "Pride," Ruth answered. "Men like him can't bear losing what they consider theirs, even when they pretend it's worthless." She gestured to the children who had crept closer. "My little ones know all about men's pride. Their father died resisting it. That night, as Mercer slept near the door and Ruth's children curled together on a pallet, Clara helped the ailing woman to bed. Ruth gripped Clara's wrist with surprising strength. "I recognize what you're fighting for," she whispered. "I'm dying, Clara. The fever's been with me too long." She glanced toward her sleeping children. "But you might make it. That child might be born free." Clara felt tears threatening. "How can you be sure?" "I'm not," Ruth admitted. "But I've helped 23 souls reach freedom. 23 lives that weren't supposed to matter." Her eyes drifted to the window, where moonlight cast silver patterns on the floor. "Duncan's men will return, and when they do, we must be ready." Clara sat by the small hearth, gently combing the tangled hair of Ruth Chambers's youngest daughter. The child's eyes drooped with exhaustion, but she smiled faintly at Clara's soft humming. Through the thin walls of the modest home, Clara could hear Isaiah Mercer discussing travel plans with someone in the adjacent room. "You have a gift with children," Ruth whispered, lowering herself carefully onto a wooden stool. The woman's frame seemed impossibly fragile, her skin drawn tight across sharp cheekbones. "They trust you," Clara nodded, her hands never pausing in their gentle work. "My mother was a midwife before." She let the words trail off, unwilling to revisit memories of separation. Ruth's chest rattled with each breath, a sound Clara recognized all too well. "You know I'm dying," the frail woman stated matter-of-factly. "Consumption. The doctor gave me until winter, but I doubt I'll see the first frost." "I'm sorry," Clara murmured, resting a protective hand on her swollen belly. "Don't be. I've made my peace." Ruth leaned forward, her eyes suddenly intense. "But I need my death to mean something. For my children." She glanced toward the 3 sleeping forms huddled together on a pallet in the corner. "Duncan Fairholme's men are close. Too close." Clara felt her heart quicken. "Mercer says we'll leave at dawn." "And they'll catch you before noon," Ruth interrupted. "Unless we give them what they expect to find." She straightened her shoulders with visible effort. "Me, dressed as you, drawing them away." The comb clattered to the floor. "No," Clara whispered fiercely. "I won't trade my life for yours." "You're not asking me to die," Ruth said with a sad smile. "I'm already dying. But my children need a future." She reached for Clara's hand. "The community here will care for them, but only if Duncan's men move on, only if they believe they followed your trail elsewhere." Clara shook her head, tears threatening. "There must be another way." "There isn't." Ruth's grip tightened. "My children will live free. Your child will live free. That's worth everything to me." In the silence that followed, Clara heard the weight of Ruth's conviction, heavier than any chains she'd ever carried. This wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about legacy, about what remained when everything else was stripped away. "I'll name the baby after you," Clara finally whispered. "If it's a girl." Ruth's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Then I'll live on, won't I?" She glanced toward the door, where Mercer now stood, his weathered face grim with understanding. "We leave at midnight. The ruse must be perfect." Clara nodded, feeling the child within her stir. One woman's ending would become another's beginning. In this brutal equation of survival, Ruth had found her final purpose. A last act of defiance against a world that valued some lives at 12 cents, and others not at all. The carriage rattled down the rutted path outside Natchez, as dusk settled over the Mississippi countryside. Isaiah Mercer kept his eyes on the road ahead, his weathered hands gripping the reins with white-knuckle tension. Beside him sat Ruth Chambers, wrapped in Clara's shawl, her frail frame hunched to mimic the pregnant woman's silhouette. "They'll be waiting at the crossroads," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible above the creak of wagon wheels. "Just as we planned." Ruth nodded, her fever-bright eyes scanning the tree line. The ruse had been her idea, become the decoy while Clara remained hidden. Her cough, which she'd been suppressing for hours, finally escaped her lips. 3 miles back, Clara huddled in the earthen cellar beneath Ruth's modest home, clutching the hand of Ruth's 12-year-old daughter, Sarah. The girl's face was streaked with dried tears, but her grip remained steady. "Mama said to count to 1,000, Sarah whispered. "Then we'll know." Clara nodded, her free hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. The child within kicked, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. The ambush came swiftly. 4 of Duncan Fairholm's men emerged from the shadows, their horses blocking the narrow road. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a pockmarked face, raised his hand. "That's far enough, Mercer," he called out. "Hand over the woman, and we might let you live." Isaiah slowed the wagon. "I'm just taking my wife to her sister's," he replied, the practiced lie falling easily from his lips. The leader laughed. "Your wife? That's the Fairholm property you're harboring." He dismounted, approaching the wagon. "Worth 12 cents and a whole lot of trouble." Ruth lowered her head, pulling the shawl tighter. When the man yanked it away, his momentary confusion gave Isaiah the opening he needed. The former slave trader drew his concealed pistol. Firing a warning shot into the air, chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the twilight. Ruth lunged from the wagon, drawing the pursuers away from Isaiah as planned. She ran with surprising speed for someone so ill. But it wasn't enough. The shot rang out, and she crumpled to the ground, her blood soaking into the Louisiana soil. In the cellar, Clara and Sarah reached 1,000 in their count. The silence above was deafening. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice small in the darkness. Clara took a sharp piece of wood from the floor and, by feel alone, carved Ruth's name into the cellar beam. "Now we remember," she whispered. "Your mother gave us a chance. We honor her by surviving." Hours later, when Isaiah returned alone, his shirt stained with blood not his own, Clara didn't need to ask what happened. The sacrifice had been made. As dawn broke over the horizon, Clara silently vowed that Ruth Chambers' death would not be in vain. The road to freedom stretched before her, bought with a price far greater than 12 cents. The night Clara left Willow Bend, the moon hid behind thick clouds as if ashamed to witness Ruth Chambers' sacrifice. With Isaiah Mercer nursing a bullet wound to his shoulder, Clara found herself entrusted to strangers, the first link in a human chain stretching toward an uncertain freedom. "Keep your head down and your voice lower," whispered Eliza, a free woman of color, who arrived with a cart of vegetables the morning after the ambush. She hid Clara beneath burlap sacks, the rough fabric scratching against her swollen belly as they traveled through back roads. Each safe house brought new faces, new rules. A Creole family in Pine Crossing fed her gumbo and warned her never to look directly at travelers on the road. An elderly white couple, their hands calloused from farming, kept her in their root cellar for 3 days when bounty hunters passed through. Duncan Fairholm's men are offering $5 for information, the farmer told his wife, unaware Clara could hear through the floorboards. They're saying she's worth more than they paid. Clara memorized routes by starlight, learned to walk without sound, and practiced different accents to disguise her origin. Her pregnancy advanced, making movement more difficult, but also serving as her disguise. Few suspected a heavily pregnant woman of being a fugitive. In a small cabin near the Atchafalaya Basin, Clara met Solomon, a boatman with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by hers. "I'll take you downriver," he said simply. "The water leaves no tracks." During their journey, Solomon taught Clara to identify which houses might offer shelter by subtle signs. A certain pattern of laundry on a line, a lantern placed in a specific window. The Underground Railroad spoke in whispers and symbols, its language indecipherable to those who didn't need its salvation. "Trust is luxury," Solomon told her as they approached New Orleans. "But without some measure of it, we'd all be lost." When fever overtook Mercer in a safe house outside the city, Clara sat beside him, cooling his forehead with damp cloths. His delirium brought confessions that would haunt her long after their paths diverged. Clara learned to answer to different names: Sarah, Josephine, Mary. shedding identities like worn clothes. She buried her true name deep inside, alongside memories of the auction block and the 12 cents that had valued her life. Each helper risked imprisonment or worse. A Creole seamstress altered dresses to accommodate Clara's growing belly. A formerly enslaved cook taught her New Orleans recipes to help her blend in once she reached the city. "Remember," the cook said, pressing a small pouch of herbs into Clara's palm, "freedom isn't just about running away. It's about becoming someone they can't recognize anymore." As New Orleans grew closer, Clara cradled her unborn child and whispered promises. Not of wealth or ease, but of the one thing she was fighting to secure with every careful step, a future unwritten by masters. The cramped attic room in the safe house on the outskirts of New Orleans offered little comfort beyond shelter. Clara dabbed Isaiah Mercer's forehead with a damp cloth, watching his chest rise and fall with labored breaths. The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, turning his weathered skin ashen and his once alert eyes glassy. "Water," he rasped, and Clara held a tin cup to his cracked lips. Outside, rain pattered against the single window, providing cover for their whispered conversations. The elderly couple who owned the modest dwelling had warned them to keep quiet. Duncan Fairholme's men were still searching the city. "I need to tell you something," Mercer whispered, gripping Clara's wrist with surprising strength. "Before it's too late." Clara leaned closer, her swollen belly pressing against the edge of the thin mattress. "Save your strength." The former slave trader shook his head. "Richmond, 12 years ago. The auction at Willow Creek." His words came between shallow breaths. "I was there, when your family was sold." The room seemed to tilt beneath Clara. She remembered that day. The smell of tobacco, her mother's silent tears, her father's hands bound behind his back. "I didn't buy or sell," Mercer continued, "but I watched, did nothing." His eyes found hers, pleading. "My daughter, Eliza, she was only 16 when they took her. I tried to help a family escape. Punishment was losing my own child." Clara's throat tightened. "What happened to her?" "Sold to Florida. Never found her." A tear slid down his temple. "Everything since, trying to make it right. Can't bring her back, but maybe save someone else." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof. Clara remembered Ruth Chambers' sacrifice, the woman who had died in her place. Now Mercer, another link in this chain of atonement and survival. "I forgive you," Clara said, the words surprising her as they left her mouth. Mercer's eyes widened slightly. "Don't deserve it." "It's not about deserving," she replied. "It's about continuing." That night, Isaiah Mercer slipped away in his sleep. Clara closed his eyes and placed his worn Bible on his chest. The elderly couple helped her bury him in their garden under cover of darkness, marking the spot with a small stone. Standing over the fresh earth, Clara felt the baby kick inside her. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the movement beneath her palm. Mercer's confession had changed nothing and everything. Her past remained broken, but her path forward was clearer now. "We continue alone," she whispered to her unborn child as she turned back toward the house. The road ahead would be hers to forge, without Mercer, without William Fairholme, without anyone who had come before. Just her, her child, and whatever strength remained. William Fairholme writhed in his bed, sweat beading across his brow as another wave of pain tore through his abdomen. The plantation house, once a symbol of his family's prosperity, had become his prison, and now it seemed his deathbed. "More water," he gasped to the house servant who hovered anxiously by his bedside. The physician had come and gone 3 times already, each visit ending with the same diagnosis, a fever of unknown origin. But the whispers among the staff told a different story. Duncan had been seen conferring with a woman from the bayou, known for her knowledge of local plants, both healing and deadly. In his lucid moments, William knew the truth. His brother had always been calculating, but this final act of betrayal stemmed from something deeper than sibling rivalry. Duncan Fairholme couldn't bear the shame William had brought to the family name by attempting to free Clara. The young woman's auction for 12 cents had been just the beginning of Duncan's revenge. "Master William needs rest," the servant murmured to the housekeeper who came to inquire. Both knew their words were hollow. Rest would not save him now. In his feverish dreams, William saw Clara standing on the auction block, her chin raised in defiance, despite her condition. He had failed her. His cowardice had allowed Duncan to orchestrate that humiliating sale. Now, as poison worked through his system, he wondered if she had found safety, if her child had been born, if somewhere beyond Greenshire she had discovered the freedom he couldn't provide. Duncan visited only once during William's illness, standing at the foot of the bed with cold eyes that betrayed no emotion. "You've brought this on yourself," he said simply before turning away. The younger Fairholme didn't have the strength to respond. What could he say? That love had compelled him to defy the order of things? That he had recognized Clara's humanity when others saw only property? Such words would fall on deaf ears in this house. By the 5th day, William could no longer speak. The household prepared for the inevitable, and Judge Amos Crenshaw was notified of the heir's impending death. The old judge, upon hearing the news, merely nodded, another entry in the ledger of Greenshire's tragedies. As darkness fell across the plantation, William's breathing grew shallow. His final thoughts were not of his brother's betrayal or the family fortune he would never inherit. Instead, he pictured Clara, free and alive, cradling her child somewhere beyond Duncan's reach. This imagined future was the only peace he found as life slipped away. William Fairholme died as he had lived, quietly, with regrets that outweighed his accomplishments. His passing closed a chapter in Greenshire's story. But elsewhere, the narrative continued without him. Judge Amos Crenshaw sat alone in his study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk. The letter announcing William Fairholme's death lay open before him, the ink still fresh. Outside, rain tapped against the windows of his Greenshire home, a gentle rhythm that failed to soothe his troubled mind. Fever, the letter claimed. But Crenshaw knew better. The whispers had reached even his ears. Duncan had arranged his brother's poisoning, erasing the family shame with a final act of betrayal. The judge rubbed his temples, feeling every one of his 72 years pressing down upon him. Next to William's death notice lay another document, a report from Duncan's men. The search for Clara had failed. She had vanished into the labyrinth of New Orleans, leaving nothing but rumors and dead ends. The woman sold for 12 cents had somehow outmaneuvered them all. Crenshaw pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer. His hand trembled slightly as he dipped his quill into the inkwell. "I, Amos Crenshaw, being of sound mind. I name Amos Crenshaw." Then he began, the words flowing with unexpected ease. This confession would not see a courtroom, would not face the scrutiny of law. This was for his conscience alone. He wrote of how he had known the auction was a mockery of justice, a public humiliation orchestrated by Duncan to punish both Clara and William. He admitted watching silently as Isaiah Mercer purchased her, suspecting even then that the transaction was part of a larger scheme. The judge had recognized the trap being laid but chose to look away, hiding behind statutes and precedents. "I could have voided the sale," he wrote, the quill scratching across the paper. "I could have intervened when Duncan's men set out in pursuit. The law afforded me discretion I refused to exercise." The old man paused, listening to the courthouse clock strike 11. How many lives had been shaped by his decisions? How many souls had he sacrificed on the altar of order? When finished, Crenshaw sealed the letter with wax and locked it in the bottom drawer of his desk. Perhaps someday, someone would find it. Perhaps not. Either way, his confession would change nothing for Clara, for William, or for Ruth Chambers, whose death near Natchez had also reached his ears. The judge extinguished his candle and moved to the window. The rain had stopped. leaving the streets gleaming under a quarter moon. Somewhere out there, a woman who had been valued at less than a loaf of bread was forging a new life. He would never know her fate, and she would never know of his complicity. But the courthouse walls had witnessed it all. Every auction, every judgment, every silence. And in their mute testimony lay a truth that no locked drawer could contain. The cobblestone streets of Treme welcomed Clara as she waddled through its narrow passages, her swollen belly preceding her like a shield. 7 months had passed since the auction block in Greenshire, and New Orleans had become her sanctuary. The bustling quarter hummed with life. Free black artisans bent over their crafts. Creole musicians tuned instruments on porches, and market women called out their wares in a melodic blend of French, Spanish, and African dialects. Louise Baptiste, she whispered to herself, testing the weight of her new name on her tongue. The identity had been gifted to her by a gray-haired seamstress who had taken one look at her desperate eyes and understood. In Treme, reinvention wasn't just possible, it was a tradition. The young woman found lodging in a cramped attic above a laundry house where the owner, Madame Josephine, asked few questions. The arrangement was simple. Clara, now Louise, would wash linens from dawn until dusk, her fingers raw from lye soap and scalding water, in exchange for the tiny room and daily meals. "You sing beautifully," Madame Josephine remarked one afternoon, pausing to listen as Louise hummed while scrubbing a stubborn stain. The pregnant woman smiled faintly. "My mother taught me gullah songs from the islands." She rarely spoke of her past, but the music flowed from her unbidden, a connection to what she had lost. At night, alone in her room, Louise would press her palms against her belly, feeling the child within her kick and roll. "Your name will be your own," she whispered. "Not your father's, not your master's." The baby responded with a flutter, as if understanding the promise. The community embraced her gradually. A cooper's wife brought her extra portions of gumbo. A blacksmith fashioned her a small knife that she kept tucked in her skirts. Children ran errands for her when her ankles swelled too much for walking. Louise learned the rhythm of Treme, which streets to avoid when bounty hunters prowled, which doors would open to a desperate knock, which faces could be trusted. She absorbed the city's secret language. A yellow ribbon tied to a porch post meant danger. A particular knock pattern signified safe passage. Each morning she rose before the sun, watching dawn break over the Mississippi. The river's constant flow reminded her of Isaiah Mercer's words before fever took him. "Water knows no master." In those quiet moments, Louise allowed herself to imagine a future where her child would never know the auction block or feel the sting of a whip. The baby kicked vigorously, as if sharing her defiance. Louise placed her hand over the movement and smiled. Every sunrise was another day Duncan Fairholm had failed to reclaim her. Every breath was freedom, hard-won and precious. The pains began at dusk. Clara, now known to everyone in Treme as Louise Baptiste, gripped the edge of her small cot as the first contractions seized her body. The cobbler's shop below had closed hours ago, leaving only the rhythmic sounds of night insects and distant music from the quarter. Madame Josephine, the neighborhood midwife, arrived within the hour, her weathered hands carrying a basket of herbs and clean linens. "Your baby comes tonight," she whispered, lighting candles around the modest room. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the bare walls as Louise nodded, sweat already beading on her forehead. Through the night, Louise labored. Each contraction brought memories flooding back. The auction block, Mercer's wagon, Ruth's sacrifice. The midwife wiped her brow with cool cloths and murmured encouragements as the hours stretched endlessly. "Push now, child," Madame Josephine commanded as dawn approached. Louise bore down with all her remaining strength, her cries muffled against a rolled cloth. With one final, tremendous effort, her daughter slipped into the world, announcing her arrival with a piercing wail that seemed to carry all the way to the Mississippi. "A girl," the midwife announced, cleaning the infant with practiced hands. "Strong lungs, strong spirit." Louise reached for her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "Ruth," she whispered, cradling the tiny form against her chest. "Her name is Ruth." The baby's eyes, still unfocused, seemed to search her mother's face as tiny fingers curled around Louise's thumb. Word spread quickly through the close-knit community. By midday, the room above the cobbler's shop had become a place of quiet celebration. Women from neighboring houses brought bowls of gumbo and freshly baked bread. An elderly man who had escaped bondage 40 years earlier placed a small carved wooden bird beside the bed, a symbol of freedom. Monsieur Dupree, the cobbler who had given Louise shelter when she first arrived, stood in the doorway, his cap in his hands. "The child will never want for family," he promised, his Creole accent thick with emotion. As twilight fell again, the visitors gathered around mother and child. They sang softly, hymns from Georgia plantations, mixed with rhythms from Congo Square, and prayers in languages that had crossed the ocean generations before. Louise closed her eyes, letting the harmonies wash over her. For the first time since leaving Greenshire, she felt something beyond survival, something like belonging. Her tears were no longer just for what she had lost, but for what she had found. Little Ruth slept peacefully in her arms, unaware of the journey that had brought her here, or the woman whose name she carried. In this moment, in this room above a humble shop in New Orleans, Louise was no longer alone. She had become part of a tapestry woven from shared suffering and collective hope, a community that understood the value of a single human life far exceeded 12 cents. The streets of New Orleans teemed with life, a labyrinth of alleyways and hidden courtyards that swallowed secrets whole. Duncan Fairholme's men stalked through the French Quarter, their northern accents and stiff demeanors marking them as strangers. They carried crude sketches of Clara, offering coins for information about a young colored woman with a newborn. But New Orleans had its own language, its own code. When these men entered establishments asking questions, conversations would shift, eyes would glance away, and information would dissolve like morning mist on the Mississippi. The city protected its own, especially those who needed protection most. A runaway with a child, they would say, slipping coins across countertops. Worth more than she was sold for? In the Tremaine neighborhood, where Clara had found sanctuary as Louise Baptiste, warnings traveled faster than the bounty hunters. Doors would close, windows would shutter, and children would be called inside whenever unfamiliar boots echoed on the cobblestones. 3 months of searching yielded nothing but frustration for Duncan's men. Every promising lead evaporated. A laundress spotted near the market disappeared before they arrived. A woman with a baby at the church vanished between prayers. The river fog seemed to conspire with the city itself, obscuring paths and erasing tracks. Meanwhile, in Greenshire, Duncan paced the halls of his plantation house, his rage growing with each passing day. The 12-cent auction had been meant as his masterstroke, a public humiliation of both Clara and his brother William. Instead, it had become his own disgrace. "How does a pregnant woman simply vanish?" he demanded of his foreman, slamming his fist against the mahogany desk. The plantation owner's reputation had suffered. Whispers followed him at social gatherings. Even Judge Crenshaw avoided his company now, the old man's eyes carrying something that looked uncomfortably like judgment. By summer's end, Duncan recalled his men from New Orleans. The expense had become unjustifiable. The failure too obvious to ignore. The 12 cents he had accepted for Clara had bought him nothing but suspicion from his peers and defiance from those he considered beneath him. As his carriage rolled back toward Greenshire after his final trip to New Orleans, Duncan stared out at the swampland. Somewhere in this vast, humid landscape, a woman he had tried to destroy was rebuilding her life. The thought burned in him like poison. What Duncan couldn't know was that Clara had already won. Each day she remained free was another victory. Each time her daughter Ruth's laughter echoed in the courtyard behind the cobbler's shop was proof that some things, dignity, hope, motherhood, could never be priced at 12 cents. In the autumn of 1889, dust swirled around the demolition site of the old Greenshire courthouse. 3 decades of Louisiana history crumbled beneath sledgehammers and crowbars, as workers cleared space for a more modern structure. Among them, Elijah Wilson, a carpenter's assistant, discovered a peculiar seam in the paneling of what had once been Judge Amos Crenshaw's chambers. "Found something here," he called out, prying loose a hidden drawer that had been sealed into the wall itself. Inside lay 2 yellow documents, a confession penned in the shaky hand of an aging judge, and fragments of a letter signed by Isaiah Mercer. The courthouse foreman almost discarded them as trash, but a young clerk recognized the Fairholme name and preserved the papers. The documents eventually reached Professor Thomas Whitfield at Tulane University, who specialized in antebellum Louisiana history. The professor's fingers trembled as he pieced together the remarkable story of Clara, the woman sold for 12 cents while carrying a child, and the complex web of lives entangled in her fate. "This changes our understanding of resistance," Whitfield told his colleagues at a historical society meeting. "Not just the Underground Railroad's operations in Louisiana, but the personal motivations behind them." The confession revealed Judge Crenshaw's deliberate inaction, his knowledge of Duncan Fairholme's plot to punish both Clara and William through the humiliating auction. The judge had written of his regret, admitting that order without justice was merely tyranny disguised as law. He had died in 1874, taking most of his secrets to the grave, but leaving this one confession behind. Mercer's fragmented letter provided clues about safe houses and allies. Though names had been deliberately obscured, it mentioned a woman's sacrifice near Natchez and a child born in New Orleans, but offered no definitive proof of Clara's ultimate fate. Local newspapers published sensationalized accounts of the 12-cent woman as she came to be known. Former residents of Greenshire recalled whispers about the Fairholme brothers' rivalry and William's mysterious death, but memories had faded and twisted with time. Historians debated whether Clara had truly escaped or met a darker end. Some claimed to have interviewed elderly residents of Treme who remembered a midwife called Louise, who never spoke of her past. Others insisted the story was embellished, a parable about the cruelties of slavery rather than documented fact. What remained undisputed was the bill of sale itself, preserved in parish records. One enslaved woman, with child, sold for 12 cents to Isaiah Mercer on March 18, 1853. The courthouse that witnessed this transaction was now gone, its bricks and timbers carted away. But the story they contained had finally escaped, joining the countless narratives that formed the complicated tapestry of American memory. Some threads visible, others hidden, all essential to the whole. By the spring of 1873, Louise Baptiste had become a fixture in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans. Few remembered her as Clara, the woman once sold for 12 cents. Her weathered hands, now skilled in the art of bringing life into the world, had delivered over 100 babies. The community respected her not only as a midwife, but as a keeper of stories and wisdom. Her daughter, Ruth Baptiste, had grown into a beautiful young woman of 20. Teaching children in a small schoolhouse established by freedmen after the war. Ruth possessed her mother's quiet dignity and determination, but none of her memories of bondage. She walked the cobblestone streets with a freedom that Louise sometimes watched with wonder and pride. "My mother could read before it was allowed," Ruth would tell her students, never knowing that Louise had learned those letters in secret, by candlelight in the years after their arrival in Treme. The story of their journey, the auction block, Isaiah Mercer's wagon, and the sacrifice of the first Ruth remained locked in Louise's heart. On warm evenings, neighbors would gather in the courtyard behind the cobbler's shop where Ruth had been born. The old Creole violinist would play melodies that seemed to speak directly to Louise, reminding her of songs from Virginia, from her mother's lips. Sometimes she would hum along, and the younger folks would fall silent, sensing something ancient and powerful in her voice. "That woman knows sorrow," they whispered, but she never let it own her. The stories about Louise grew with each telling. Some said she had walked from Mississippi with nothing but faith. Others claimed she had outsmarted a dozen slave catchers. The truth, that Duncan Fairholme's men had killed a woman bearing her name, that Judge Crenshaw had looked away from justice, that William Fairholme had died still dreaming of her freedom, faded into whispers. What remained true was the dignity Louise had carved from circumstances meant to destroy her. She taught other women to deliver babies, to read signs of illness, to blend healing herbs. She saved what little money she earned to ensure Ruth could continue her education. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Louise would touch the small wooden pendant she wore, carved from a splinter of Mercer's wagon after he passed. It was her private memorial to those who had helped her journey. Isaiah Mercer, the first Ruth, and even William, whose failed attempt at kindness had set everything in motion. "Your name carries weight," Louise once told her daughter. "Remember that you were born free, but never forget those who weren't." In the neighborhoods of Treme, Louise Baptiste's legacy took root, not in courthouse records or history books, but in the living memory of a community that understood the value of survival. The ledgers of Greenshire Courthouse were eventually reduced to dust, but the story of Clara transcended ink and paper. In the worn evening gatherings of Treme in the late 19th century, Louise Baptiste, as she was known to her neighbors, would sit on her porch, her weathered hands still nimble as they stitched together quilts and memories alike. Her daughter Ruth, now a grown woman with children of her own, had inherited her mother's quiet strength and healing touch. The 12 cents that once defined Clara's worth had become a family legend, whispered rather than proclaimed. Those copper coins, meant to humiliate, had instead become the first investment in a legacy of resilience. Louise never spoke of Duncan Fairholme or the auction block to strangers, but in private moments with Ruth, she shared fragments of truth not to burden, but to illuminate the path they had traveled. "Freedom isn't given," she would tell her daughter. "It's claimed, piece by piece, day by day." In the cobbler's shop where Ruth had been born, a small community gathered each Sunday to share meals and music. The rhythms of Congo Square mixed with hymns and work songs, creating something new yet ancient. Louise taught the children to read from dog-eared books passed secretly between households. Her lessons extended beyond letters. She taught them to listen for warnings in the wind, to find allies in unlikely places, to recognize the difference between law and justice. The Treme neighborhood embraced Louise as one of their own, never questioning the shadows that sometimes crossed her face when strangers passed through. The midwife, who had delivered countless babies into freedom, became known for her healing hands and calming presence. Few connected this dignified woman to the pregnant slave once sold for pennies in a parish courthouse. Judge Crenshaw's confession remained locked away for decades, a silent testament to complicity. When finally discovered during renovations in 1889, the yellowed paper caused brief interest among historians before being cataloged and forgotten again. By then, Louise had already passed her stories to Ruth, who passed them to her children. Isaiah Mercer's sacrifice, Ruth Chambers' final act of courage, William Fairholme's failed attempt at redemption, all became threads in a tapestry woven across generations. The true triumph was not escape alone, but the quiet persistence of memory and dignity against forces that sought to erase them. Clara had been sold for 12 cents, but Louise Baptiste died surrounded by a wealth that Duncan Fairholme could never have imagined. Love freely given, stories freely shared, and a family whose very existence defied the auction block. Justice, in the end, was not found in courthouses, but in the enduring power of a woman who refused to be defined by the price once placed upon her head.